Very early in my ministry career, I fell in love with expository preaching, both in the sermons that I heard as well as the sermons that I delivered. And I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that expository preaching is better for most pastors than topical or textual sermons. And in this video, I'm going to tell you why. Let's do this. Well, hey guys, I'm Thomas Costello here from ReachRight, where we dedicate ourselves to helping pastors and church leaders reach more people and grow. We put out new content like this every single week. So if you're into these kinds of discussions, be sure to hit that subscribe button below and hit like on the video. It means a lot to us. Now, before we get into this, we probably need to define our terms. When we talk about expository teaching, what are we talking about? Well, first, let's decide what it isn't. There's two other primary types of sermons. I'd call those topical sermons, which is where you talk about a topic and usually you pick a handful of verses from different parts of the Bible to make a broader point on a theme or a topic that you would like to address with your church. There's nothing wrong with topical teaching. I think it is something that is a good tool to use, but I want to make a case today why it's probably not the best way to preach on a week-to-week basis at your church. There's also textual sermons, and what I mean by that is maybe a sermon that's based on a very small portion of text and you're doing a deep dive into a verse. Maybe you're doing a word study on several different words within a single verse. And maybe this would work for books of the Bible like Proverbs, where every verse is really its own saying and you can build a whole sermon from that. But for the most part, I don't think that works as well for other types of literature that are in Scripture. By and large, I believe that expository preaching is the best way to preach. And when I say expository, here's what I mean. It's when you choose a passage of Scripture and you teach in a way that the original author's point is also your point. So when Paul writes in his letter to the Philippians, your goal in preaching is to communicate the same thing that Paul was teaching that church to your church on a Sunday morning. And typically what that looks like is expository teaching goes through books of the Bible. So as opposed to doing a series on summer at the movies at your church, you would do a series on the book of Philippians, where you might spend a couple of weeks on every single chapter and do a deep dive unpacking exactly what Paul wanted to say to that church in Philippi, and then helping your church infer what it means for us today, 2,000 years in the future. Now, it may not be the easiest way to preach, although I think you can make a case that it does make some things easier. And I actually have 5 reasons why I believe your church should pivot to a expository style of preaching. Let me start with the first one. Expository preaching helps us with scriptural faithfulness. When we choose to align ourselves and teach only what the original author was trying to say in that original text, it forces us to stay really close to the text and in general keeps us closer to Scripture. Now, I'm not saying that if you try to preach expository messages, you cannot have error in your teaching. Obviously, you still can, but I think the opportunities for errors are much smaller because as the preacher, it gives me fewer opportunities to impose my own ideas or own thoughts on what the original author had to say. So that is one huge win for expository teaching. The second advantage is it really promotes biblical literacy, and this one for me is huge. As a pastor, one of my goals is always to have the people of my church become self-feeding. I believe that expository preaching helps the people within your church become more Bible literate because they're having to go into a passage of Scripture and you're giving them context and they're opening their Bible and they're seeing it come alive right before them, often for the first time. One of my goals whenever I do a expository message is to preach in a way that seems almost overly simple. My hope is that when someone hears my message, maybe they would think, well, what Thomas is doing really isn't all that complicated. I could probably do that on my own. And it starts to build a thirst for people to read the Bible for themselves. In my experience, churches that do expository preaching are much more likely to have biblically literate members that love to read the Word on their own time. And this is just one of the great byproducts of regular expository teaching. Here's another benefit. It's the balance of topics. One of the challenges of doing topical sermons is you tend to get into some of the more familiar familiar topics that you are comfortable with as a pastor or a preacher over and over again. I've heard hundreds of messages on the love of God, and I've heard maybe one message on the wrath of God. And this is one of the advantages of expository preaching. When we cover whole books of the Bible, we actually talk about topics as often as the Bible mentions them. For instance, if you were to go through the entire Gospel of Luke, yeah, you would have many messages about love and the story of the prodigal son, but you'd also have to deal with messages about the cost of discipleship. And when Jesus talks about bringing the sword rather than bringing peace, those are harder to deal with in some situations, but it gives your church the entirety of the gospel message. And I think this is really important. The next advantage is kind of like it. Expository preaching reduces pastoral bias in our sermons. Now, we all have things that we like to talk about, or maybe certain parts of our theology that we want to major on. But what expository teaching does is it makes us balance that out. We can all imagine those horror stories of churches where they talk about tithing every third week and that's all they ever focus on. Or maybe you're from the opposite, where you really just hate talking about tithing and you avoid it at all costs. Well, your biases as a pastor, if you're teaching topically, they will rise to the surface at some point. When you teach in an expository style, where you're going through books of the Bible, verse by verse, and teaching what the original author meant, there will be no stone unturned. All of those biases that we may have, they will be uncovered because we're using the Bible as our guide. And one more thing that I've found about expository teaching is it makes preparation much easier. When I was a young minister and first planting a church and had to come up with a preaching calendar, I would stay up late at night and really wrestle with all the things that God would want me to say to my church and the things that I would want to talk about and the passages to pull it from. And expository preaching really simplified that whole process for me. In the same way, I would still pray and ask God, what would you want to say to our church? But instead of looking for specific topics week in and week out to cover, I would just pray for wisdom on what book of the Bible we should be talking about within our church. And we would be covered for a period of time. In fact, I actually spent 2 years teaching verse by verse through the entire Gospel of Luke at my church. At the end of the 2-year period, that is a 50-hour deep dive into an entire gospel and the whole range of topics. We actually decided to have some fun with it, and on the last day of the series, we actually had a graduation ceremony complete with little diplomas saying that you were now a Luke scholar. It was really a fun thing to do, but I loved the way that expository teaching allowed us to minimize all of the effort that went into figuring out the specific topics, but it let us just focus on exactly what the word would have to say. But I want to know what you think. Does your church use a more topical format, or maybe you do more textual sermons? Or maybe you're like me and you love expository teaching. Let us know down in the comments what's working for you, and we'll catch you next time.